All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining me tonight. I hope wherever you are warm and cozy. I know in Norman today it was a high of 24, I think, so a little bit warmer, getting there. But hopefully next week is a beautiful week to start our spring gardens and our maybe some cool season veggies. So if you're just now joining us for the very first webinar of our series, my name is Courtney. I am the Cleveland County Horticulture Educator. We've been teaching this spring garden series, which is kind of an overview of a lot of basic beginning gardening topics. And tonight's presentation, what we're going to be talking about, it's really kind of a good pair with last week. So hopefully if you're on, you attended last week or watched the recording, I sent that out this morning. President's Day and snow days made me a little lazy. So it got out this morning if you haven't had a chance to watch it yet. But last week we were talking all about like site selection and how to build raised beds and how to think about picking out varieties. So everything you really want to do before you put plants in the ground. And so now what we're going to talk about this evening is everything that really happens after you put plants in the ground. So there's kind of two parts to tonight. The first part, we are going to do what I like to refer to as veggie speed dating. And so we will go through a lot of the common vegetables that you can grow and then just some quick tips and tricks for those specific vegetables. And then to wrap up the presentation, we will cover some season-long success strategies that really apply to all the vegetables and things that you can do after you put those plants into the ground. So before we get started, a couple housekeeping items. If you could, please keep your microphone muted. Just helps us with having a peaceful Zoom. Sometimes when there's dogs barking or things in the background, it can get a little distracting. So if you could, please keep your microphone muted. If you have questions, please place those in the chat. We will be checking that periodically throughout this evening. Anne is my master gardener buddy who's helping me out this evening. She'll be monitoring the chat as well as making sure everyone stays muted and people are admitted into our waiting room. We are also recording, so just keep that in mind. If you haven't already, please do fill out the pre-assessment. I just threw that in the chat. Just kind of asking some beginning questions to get a feel for where everybody's at. We will send a post-assessment afterwards. And so if you could please take the time to fill that out, we would really appreciate that. And then kind of just a slight caveat, if you will, I am in Cleveland County, Oklahoma. And so if you have questions that are maybe more or questions that are specific to outside of Oklahoma, if you're joining us from there, just please keep that in mind that my gardening experience is in central Oklahoma. So if you have questions about artichokes or rhubarb or things that we can't really grow here very well, I will do my best to answer those with the knowledge that I have. But we will, if you do have those questions, let me know and we can at least email back and forth afterwards and figure that out. So we will get started. So when it comes to gardening and talking to new gardeners and people who are just getting started, I have two number one garden rules. So first is to start out small. If you are new to gardening, haven't gardened before, you might catch the bug and the spring fever and get very excited and pull the entire backyard up, or maybe even the front yard too, and turn it into a vegetable garden. That can be really fun in April, May, June, but when you get into July and August and it's scorching hot and you're maybe carrying the water hose all around the backyard, you may begin to lose motivation. So my suggestion is to start out small and build from there. See how you can garden in a way that fits your lifestyle and the time that you have so that you enjoy the wonderful world of veggie gardening and not begin to resent it, because it can be easy to resent your garden in August. So start out small. And two, grow what you will actually eat. There are so many pretty varieties of radishes out there. And every year I'm like, man, I really want to, these are just the French breakfast, the icicles. Like, I'm going to grow these radishes. I don't even like radishes. I think they're just a little bit spicy. Um, haven't been able to get into them. Want to, but I haven't been able to do it. So this to say, don't devote the gardening space in your garden to something that you don't want to eat. Grow the things that you like to eat that you will use regularly. If you want to have a small portion with maybe some experimentation to try it, go for it. But just try to focus on, especially when you're getting started, those things that you know you will use in the kitchen and you know that you will enjoy eating and not feel forced to eat. So those are my two number one gardening rules. So with that, we will get started with vegetable profiles, beginning with the only, or really one of the only perennial vegetables that we can grow in Oklahoma. So this is kind of how the slides are outlined. I'll just say real quickly. So asparagus, it's in the lily family. And it's important to consider which family the vegetable it is that you're growing is in, because the management characteristics of those veggies can be similar among families. And then also we'll mention crop rotation later. When you have crop rotation and you're practicing that, you do it based on the family, not necessarily the individual vegetable. So knowing your families can be helpful. It can also kind of help you have some tips on maybe some pests or diseases to expect. So it's a good idea to know the family that your vegetable that you're wanting to grow is in. And asparagus is in the lily family. So when you grow asparagus, you're actually eating the shoots that pop up out of the ground. And if you're new to gardening or haven't seen asparagus growing before, sometimes people think like you're joking. That's not how asparagus grows. But no, it does pop out of the ground and you actually harvest those stems as it comes out of the ground. When you plant asparagus, you're purchasing crowns. So they're kind of an underground structure that will eventually spread out and take over an area. Now, it is a perennial crop, so you want to give at least 3 years before you take a harvest. Those first few years, as you're harvesting asparagus, or if you do harvest that asparagus, it can weaken the plant. So we want that plant to get a little bit more mature, be able to withstand the act of harvesting by having those 3 years. And so typically in Oklahoma, we harvest in April to May. So it's one of the first veggies that we can have. And then after that, what the plant does is it will fern out. It's actually a really pretty plant. And if you're into edible landscaping or anything like that, having asparagus in your garden can be kind of fun because it adds just a sort of a whimsical looking ferny type texture to the garden. And so as it's ferned out, it's photosynthesizing, it's gathering those sugars and that energy, and it's putting it back into the plant so that it will come back next year and you can have a perennial crop. So next we will go through the cool season veggies. And so cool season veggies you can get started with here pretty soon. I wouldn't maybe do it today or tomorrow, just for your sake. I wouldn't get out there. But next week, when it's a little bit warm, spend some time in the garden and you can start some of this stuff. So we'll start with lettuce. And so lettuce is in the sunflower family. So actually related to that pretty ornamental that we can grow. I have the spacing on these slides, and that's it's a square foot based spacing. And so that's really better suited for a raised bed or a small vegetable backyard type setting. Um, if you're interested in more information on square foot gardening, kind of the person who sort of spearheaded that movement was Mel Bartholomew. And so if you want more information specific to square foot gardening, check out some of his work. But for tonight, we have the square foot spacing in the slides. And so lettuce, you can plant 4 plants per square foot. So that's a 6-inch by 6-inch spacing. If you're growing like a leaf lettuce, that you can even go smaller than 4 plants per square. But if you were growing like a butterhead or a romaine, that 6-inch spacing is a good bet. Now, the challenge with lettuce sometimes is that it will begin to bolt if temperatures become too warm. And of course, in Oklahoma, when we have the wild waves of weather that we do in the springtime, we can see warm temperatures earlier than we may expect. And so if lettuce is exposed to prolonged warm temperatures, it begins to bolt, which is the formation of flowers. And at that point, it becomes very bitter. And so the plant's focused on creating seeds. And so to protect itself, so it can focus on that seed production, it becomes very bitter. And it's not a pleasant experience if you eat some lettuce that has started to bolt and it's got that bitter flavor. You'll have some lettuce trust issues for a little while. Um, so just be cautious and be aware. But when it is in that sweet spot and it hasn't been too hot, that homegrown lettuce is really, really delicious. It does require quite a bit of moisture. Lettuce has a pretty shallow root system. And you can also do with lettuce and a lot of the leafy green vegetables, what's called a cut and come again harvest. And that's where essentially you can cut it, give it a haircut, and it will grow back again. As opposed to like a once over harvest where you're done and you move on. And so that's kind of what lettuce can look like if it bolts. It's in the sunflower family, so little white daisy-like flowers, and you would not want to eat that. Spinach is another cool season. Spinach is in the Amaranthaceae family, and so it's very closely related to other veggies, like beets and Swiss chard. They're also in the Amaranthaceae family. Spinach will begin to bolt not so much when it's been hot, but more so when the days start to get longer. And so even if we're having a nice cool spring, but we're going into June and the days are getting longer, spinach can begin to bolt. Spinach does not like to be in a very moist, wet soil. So make sure you have really good drainage wherever it is that you're starting and growing your spinach. And then spinach is also more cold hardy than lettuce. And so lettuce really doesn't like it when it gets below freezing. It just kind of likes to hang out in that above freezing to about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. But spinach can tolerate a couple freezes, some low temps. And so if you're trying to overwinter some vegetables and have some greenery during the December and January time, maybe with a small low tunnel, spinach would be a better option than lettuce. So also in the Amaranthaceae family, Swiss chard. Was having a conversation with someone the other day and they're like, well, why grow Swiss chard? And my very quick answer was because it's pretty. Not all the time because I like to eat it, but it is a very pretty vegetable. This variety here listed in the photo or shown in the photo is a variety called Bright Lights, where they come in all sorts of pinks and oranges and yellows, where the petiole of that Swiss chard is a very pretty color. But you can cook it and eat it just like you can spinach. If you want to cook it, you can harvest. You want to harvest it before the leaves get longer than 12 inches. It starts to get a little tougher after that. You can do a cut and come again harvest. Just start with the outside leaves when you are harvesting Swiss chard. And then Swiss chard's a good one too, because it has very few pest problems. And so if you're looking for a low maintenance, easy vegetable to get started with, Swiss chard can be an option. Now, if you have deer will go after Swiss chard. I can't help you with that. But as far as diseases and insects, Swiss chard is a pretty safe bet. Collards, somebody mentioned in the pre-assessment that collards were their favorite vegetable to grow. And I thought that was really cool. Not very many people grow collards. But collards, they're in the Brassicaceae family, also referred to sometimes as the crucifers or the cole crops. There are a lot of veggies in this family, and they're all very closely related together. And so this is also going to include cabbage and Brussels sprouts, things like that. But collards can be very hardy. They can grow, they can tolerate temperatures down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And you just want to make sure that you still have some moisture, keeping moisture in that soil because again, they can get tough and it's harder to cook them down. Now, kind of funny thing about collards, essentially collards are very closely related to cabbage, except instead cabbage, the leaves sort of grow in on themselves, whereas collards are more out and you're harvesting the individual leaves. And so I always kind of try and I always make the joke that collards are like extroverted cabbage. So cabbage kind of likes to hang out and be reserved, whereas collards are open and more extroverted. So kale, another Brassicaceae. If you don't like kale, like have had it at grocery stores or maybe at restaurants, I kind of recommend, I sort of break my gardening rule with this one. Give it a shot to grow kale in the garden because homegrown kale tends to be a lot softer and not have that same very tough woody texture sometimes that you may get in like salad mixes. Or at the grocery store or at restaurants. And so give homegrown kale a chance. I'll break my gardening rule for kale. This is also a very tolerant vegetable, so it can tolerate those low temperatures, similar to spinach. So it's a good one if you want to try and push through the harsher temps of winter. Again, consistent moisture, that just really helps it from keeping tough. And if you really don't like that tough, very leafy texture, harvest it when it's nice and young, and that tends to keep that texture much softer. Cabbage, so the introverted collards. So this one, things to keep in mind that if we have a prolonged high temperatures, it will cause what are called puffy heads. And so essentially, if you see that photo there down on the right, how the leaves all wrap around each other, when we get puffy heads, those leaves begin to have space in between them. And that can be a space filled with insects, dirt, insect poop. So just be aware that if we have high temperatures in spring when you're trying to grow cabbage, there may be some issues. And I should mention with the brassicas, especially cabbage, broccoli, the cabbage worm is going to be your nemesis. And so if you ever see the little white moths floating around, those are cabbage worms. There are a couple different treatment options for that. Scouting, making sure you get on top of it early, or using an organic product called BT with regular applications can also be helpful. But I'll mention that when it comes to the brassicas, it's if you plant it, they will come. The cabbage worms will. So just be cautious and aware. Broccoli, another brassica. Broccoli is one of my favorite plants to grow, or one of my favorite veggies. So similar to puffy heads, if we have prolonged high temperatures in the area, that can cause the broccoli heads to become loose, and again, space for dirt and insects and other debris if we have high temperatures. Cool thing about broccoli, so if you're thinking about a cabbage and you harvest cabbage, it's pretty much you cut off the cabbage and it's a one and done. Broccoli, you cut off that terminal stem, and it will actually put out other side shoots. And so that's what that picture is there for an additional harvest. And so you really can get 2 harvests out of your broccoli plants. One of the reasons I like to grow it. And if you did not know, broccoli, when you're eating broccoli, you are actually eating immature flower buds. And so that's a huge cluster of flowers that broccoli head is. And if you leave it on the plant for too long, they will begin to open and you see the little yellow flowers. Sometimes you can see this in the grocery store if the broccoli is older, but that will happen if you leave it on the plant for too long. Cauliflower is very similar to broccoli with the exception of blanching. And so what that really is they would take the outer leaves of the cauliflower plant and wrap it with a rubber band, and that would prevent sunlight from getting into or onto the cauliflower and create that nice milky white kind of look and texture and flavor that you get with cauliflower. Now you can imagine that if you had acres and acres of cauliflower, let's say you were growing it commercially, it would be pretty labor intensive to go through that entire field and wrap up all of your cauliflowers. And so more modern varieties of cauliflower are self-blanching. And what that means is essentially the plants help themselves out and the leaves are bred to cover themselves and keep them white and blanched. Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts is a tough one to be able to grow because it's a very slow grower. So it needs ideal temperatures, cool season temperatures for a long period of time. And a lot of time in Oklahoma, our spring and our falls, they're too short. But that doesn't stop me. I try to grow Brussels sprouts every year. If it does get too hot, those little Brussels sprouts will just begin kind of get baby puffy heads. When you're growing it. But if you haven't seen Brussels sprouts growing before, cabbage essentially, if you picture, is a terminal growing point that's swollen and protected by leaves, whereas the Brussels sprouts, those are axillary buds, axillary growing points that are covered by leaves. And so that's what you're harvesting and you're eating. And so in a way, they are little baby cabbages. Onions. So moving on from Brassicaceae, onions are in the Amaryllidaceae family. And so they are a bulbing crop, cool season. Thing to think about when you're picking out onion varieties. So the bulbing formation, so the bulb actually swelling, that is triggered by day length. And so we have short day, intermediate day, and long day onions. And so essentially that's saying, okay, when our days get to a certain amount of time, that's when the bulbing begins to start on the onion and that bulb begins to swell. And so really in our area, short day and intermediate days are going to be more ideal because by the time the days get long enough for long day onions to begin to swell, we end up with the temperatures get too hot and the onions begin to not be as happy. You can also cure onions for a longer shelf life. And so really just kind of like laying them out, or I've seen people put them upside down, but basically what it is that those leaves, the growing point on the top of the onion, let them dry out all the way to the bulb and then cut about 2 inches above that. And it seals off the inside of that onion and prevents it from getting diseases or nastiness in there and causing the onion to rot. Peas, another, so this is a cool season legume. And so legumes are in the Fabaceae family. These are the ones, we've talked in a couple other sessions where the legumes will fix nitrogen and so add some nitrogen back to the soil. So that can be a good thing to consider. And if you want to come back wherever you plan to plant after your peas, maybe planting something there that is a fairly heavy nutrient feeder. And so peas can add a little bit back to the soil. They're similar to lettuce in the fact that they do not tolerate frosts. And so this is not one of the first vegetables that we want to plant in the springtime. So I would hold off till about March or so, and then cover it as needed. If you have excessive nitrogen in the soil, it can delay flowering. And then there are all bushing and climbing varieties, but the climbing varieties tend to be a bit more productive. You will need to provide some kind of trellising for the peas. So things to consider as you're planning out your garden. Beets, another, so this is a root veggie. It's in the Amaranthaceae family, so it's closely related to spinach and Swiss chard. And really looking at that picture of Swiss chard and those beet tops, you can see that they are very similar and closely related. And you can really cook beet greens, beet tops the same way that you cook Swiss chard. So you kind of can get more bang for your buck when growing beets. But there are lots of pretty, sometimes people say I say that vegetables are too pretty too often, but I think they're pretty. Beets come in lots of colors, and you can grow them different varieties. So I encourage you to give beets a try. When you are watching the beets grow, they'll start to kind of come up above the soil. And when you start to see about 1 to 2 inches above that soil, that's a good time to go ahead and harvest it. That way that if you let it get any larger than that, they can be kind of woody and tough to cook. But beets are also very cold tolerant. They're one of the first vegetables that you can start, and they will germinate with temperatures as low as 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So next week, if you're looking to start something, beets should be in your mix if you want to try them. Carrots. Carrots are in the Umbellifer or Apiaceae family, and they're closely related to not necessarily other vegetables, but if you grow herbs like dill or fennel, carrots are closely related to those two. Uh, if you're growing carrots, carrots can be a little tricky. Couple things to keep in mind. If you have excessive nitrogen in the soil, that will cause the carrots to focus on their tops and on their leaves. And so make sure that you're not over fertilizing with nitrogen. Probably the most important thing when growing carrots is they need a very deep, loose, almost fluffy like soil. All of the root veggies need this, but it's really crucial with carrots, especially if you're trying to grow the very long imperator type carrots. If you're not sure if it's a good variety of carrot for whatever raised bed or garden that you're working in, there are varieties of carrots that are shorter. So start with that, and if you have success, pick longer varieties until you run into if you run into issues. So I have on here that raised beds are ideal because really you can amend the soil so much that it becomes nice and fluffy and easy for those carrots to grow. The challenge is if you have rocks or dirt clods or anything like that and the carrots growing down, you will get some kind of wonky looking carrots because essentially that root's growing down and then it moves. So these are perfectly edible, they're just not as pretty. Radishes. So radish is another, it's a root veggie, but it's also in the brassica family, so closely related to that broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, those type of crops. Lots of pretty types of radishes, lots of colors, things that you can, different varieties that you can grow. Thing to keep in mind, if we have high temperatures, they can get pithy and start to kind of lose their nice crisp texture, and they can also become very overly spicy. If you're into that, no big deal, but it can change the flavor and the texture of the radishes if we have high temperatures. Now, radishes are also fun to grow because they're a very quick harvest. So some radish varieties, you can have a harvest in 21 days. 40 is is a long radish. And so you can have a very quick, satisfying harvest. And that's great if you're, say, growing with someone, trying to get someone into gardening who maybe has a short attention span. So maybe some young people, if you're wanting to kind of get them into gardening and you want them to see a quick satisfaction and a quick reward for their efforts, radishes can be a good one to try. Potatoes. So potatoes are a cool season nightshade. So they're in the Solanaceae family. They are related to tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, but those are all warm season. Potatoes are our cool season nightshade. Similar to other root veggies, well-drained soil is crucial when it comes to potatoes. So if they're sitting in water or real cloddy type soil, you can have some issues, some scuffing on the skin, rot, things like that. And so having that nice well-drained soil is important. I have on here too, if you want to buy actual seed pieces of potatoes, and so that's what you'd be getting. You can get them at farm stores, Lowe's, but you would never buy a seed packet of potato seeds. That's not how you would start potatoes. You're actually growing from the actual tuber, which will grow into a potato plant. They are sensitive to hard freezes, so if we get a late hard freeze, good idea to maybe throw a blanket or a trash bag over them, just give them a little extra protection, and then you can harvest them really early, beginning of June. I will mention, we were talking last week about containers and container growing. Potatoes are one of my favorite things to grow in smart pots, which are like these fabric container bags. Because when you're harvesting them, you can just dump out what's in the smart pot rather than having to actually dig and search for those potatoes. So that's what I like to do. All right. I'll stop real quick. Does anyone have any questions about the cool season veggies before we move on to the warm season veggies? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to keep going with the warm season veggies. So first we will start with sweet corn, and sweet corn is actually in the grass family. So it's more closely related to your, say, lawn than it is some of your other vegetables that you'd be growing. And I have this picture here, and I tell this joke or this comment every time I talk about sweet corn, but a couple years ago, I was in a rental house and I asked the landlord if I could have a garden. And he said, yeah, sure. Just make sure there's still grass in the backyard. He didn't say what kind of grass. And so I planted corn in the lawn. And this was lovingly referred to as lawn corn. It was kind of an experiment. It didn't really work out too well. But just to reiterate the fact that it is in the grass family. We didn't get our deposit back on that place, but that's okay. So when growing sweet corn, you have male and female flowers. So the male flowers are on the top, that's the tassels. And then the female flowers are along the leaves, and those are the silks. And what happens is when you're growing the sweet corn, the pollen, the wind will blow, it's a wind pollinated plant, and the pollen will leave the tassels and kind of shake down into the female flowers. And so it's important to plant into it's important to plant in a grid to get adequate pollination. And so you want it to be in a nice big cluster of multiple corn plants. You couldn't just have one corn plant and have success. So you want to have kind of a patch of corn in order to have nice pollination and even rows on your corn. Similar to almost a lawn management system, sweet corn likes a lot of water and a lot of nitrogen, and so you would want to continue applying those throughout the season to have success. Okra is another vegetable that's fairly easy to grow. Really, really likes the heat, and so it's a good one for Oklahoma. It'll keep kind of plugging through that late July, August time period. So it's a great one to grow if you're really looking for something that's tough in the summertime. It's in the Malvaceae family, which is the mallow family, closely related to cotton. And if you have any hibiscus in your garden, so like an tropical or even the perennial type hibiscus, it's in that family. So it has very few diseases and pests. The biggest thing you're probably going to face on okra are aphids, and they love to congregate around the growing point of the fruit and the flowers. And so watch out for that. But when you are harvesting okra, I want that pod to be about 3 to 4 inches long. Any longer than that, and it begins to dry out, begins to get very tough, and is better used in craft projects than it is on the dining table. Now, most everyone in the pre-assessment said that one of their favorite vegetables to grow are tomatoes. And I have to agree. It's a little passion of mine. I love tomatoes. And we could do an entire workshop on tomatoes, and if that's something you want to see, let me know. But they are in the Solanaceae family, so that's the nightshade family. As far as spacing goes, tomatoes need a bit more space, and so I have one plant per square here, but really a square foot gardening system with a tomato isn't very practical. They really need about 2 feet by 2 feet. They need a bit more space. Thing to keep in mind about tomatoes are that the ripening and the fruit development are dependent upon temperature. And so that's kind of to mean, well, let me back up. So they're a warm season crop, but they're not terribly heat tolerant. And so nighttime temperatures for tomatoes to be able to set fruit really need to be in the high 60s to have successful fruit set. We don't have that in Oklahoma for very long. And so we have to be very quick with planting our tomatoes so that we know that they're flowering when those nighttime temperatures are ideal for fruit set. Now, also, the ripening is dependent upon temperature. And so if it gets above 95 degrees, the ripening slows down on those fruit and they just kind of hang out on the vine and stay green, which if you're into fried green tomatoes, that's great. But a lot of times we want those red, juicy fruits for our caprese salads and our BLTs. And so when they're just hanging out on the vine green, it can get kind of frustrating. And so I mentioned that because that can be two of the main pain points when growing tomatoes, is that we have those temperature constraints that they don't tend to agree with Oklahoma weather quite as much. There are a lot of varieties of tomatoes you can pick out, different colors, different shapes, so many different types of varieties. But one thing to keep in mind is that there are also determinate and indeterminate varieties of tomatoes. And so determinate varieties are ones that will put on all their flowers at once, set all their fruit at once, and ripen all at once. And that can be great if you want a large flush of tomatoes all at once. And so maybe if you're a commercial grower and you can only get in the field with a crew a couple times during the season, or if you're a canner and you want a lot of tomatoes to be able to make salsa or marinara, anything like that, determinate varieties can be the go-to. But a lot of times what we end up growing in a home garden are indeterminate tomatoes. And those are tomatoes that grow progressively, where they'll grow a little bit, put on flowers, grow a little bit more. Those flowers will set fruit and we'll have more flowers, and it kind of just continues on so that our harvests continue on. And so that can be great if you're wanting the occasional tomato for a sandwich or salad, things like that. So just a couple highlights on tomatoes. Peppers. Okay, so peppers are not quite also a solanaceous plant in the nightshade family. Not quite as picky as the tomato when it comes to temperatures. We have a lot of varieties available, so you can get the hot peppers, sweet peppers, bell peppers, different types. There's a lot of pepper varieties. And if you're looking to get very, very hot peppers, stress your plants out. Back off on water, back off on fertilizer. The more stress those plants out, the hotter peppers you will get. So if that is something you are after, neglect your pepper plants a little bit. Eggplant. Eggplant is another one that will do well in high temperatures. And so along with okra, it's a good one if you're looking to get something in that July, August time period. There are a lot of varieties of eggplant, but probably one of the most common ones we grow are the Black Beauty types, which I have pictured there. Tips on harvesting. I have harvest when about it reaches the size of your palm, and so that can be a good size for an eggplant. But the key is you want to harvest it while it's still glossy. And so if it begins to get dull and starts to get a brown color to it, it's been on the plant too long. And the seeds are starting to form in the eggplant. And so when we're eating eggplant, we're eating an immature fruit. And so if we were to let that mature, the seeds would be in there and it loses its texture and its flavor. And it's not as good. So harvest it while it's still glossy before it matures. And then also a tip on here to harvest with clippers. That way, the sort of joint between the eggplant fruit and the plant is very, very thick. And if you just kind of sort of use the twist that you use with a pepper or a tomato, you would bring a bit of the plant with you and damage the plant. So use clippers when growing eggplants. Sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are in the morning glory family. And if you've ever grown like ornamental sweet potatoes in a container, sometimes you may find a big, thick sweet potato from your sweet potato vine. But if you're growing the edible type or the ones that are bred for eating, couple things. You want to keep it in a nice sandy soil. Again, with any sort of thing that's growing below the ground, a nice sandy, well-drained soil. Now, sweet potatoes are another one that do well when it's hot. They like hot days and warm nights, which is great because in Oklahoma, we have a lot of hot days and warm nights. Our limiting factor with sweet potatoes is most likely going to be our soils. And so if you have a very heavy clay soil, they may not do well. You really want that nice sandy soil. And when you're growing sweet potatoes, you propagate them from slips. So it's actual little vegetative cuttings of the uh, plant. And that's how you would start your sweet potatoes. Green beans, and so this is a warm season legume. They do not transplant well, so you don't necessarily want to start them as transplants and then move them outside. You can plant them straight into the ground and go from there. Similar to peas, there are bush beans and pole beans. This is kind of similar to tomatoes and the determinate and the indeterminate fact that bush beans will put on a flush of green beans, whereas pole beans grow more progressively. Green beans are also a legume that put nitrogen back in the soil. They're not as efficient in it as some of the other legumes like peas, but it is something to think about. Okay, cucumbers, I think we're wrapping it up with the cucurbit family. And so that's going to include our squashes, watermelons, cantaloupes, and pumpkins. So a big family that we have in the vegetable world. So cucumbers, cucumbers do have tendrils, and so those are those little curlicues, and they use them to climb trellises, and so you can grow cucumbers on a trellis. With cucumbers, and all the cucurbits, I should say, there are male and female flowers. And so it is an insect pollinated plant. And so we need our bees to still be able to grow the cucurbits. And so you can tell the difference between a male and a female flower because the female flower will have a little bit of a swollen base. It's essentially the immature fruits. So look for that. I did see a question pop up in the chat. How do sweet potatoes do in containers? They would do well. They would do well. Just make sure it's you're watering enough and that but the drainage is still there. So you may want to you'd absolutely want to use some kind of potting soil. You wouldn't want to fill that necessarily with actual garden soil. But you can absolutely do sweet potatoes in containers. Muskmelon. So someone said that their favorite vegetable to grow was cantaloupe, which I thought that was awesome. Cantaloupe, I love cantaloupe. It's one of my favorite fruits. So with the cucurbits in regards to square foot gardening, I have here 1 plant per square, but really no, if you plant them that close together, they're going to be too tight. These plants need lots of room to spread out. And so if you have limited space, it may not be the best type of vegetable for you to grow. But if you, if you don't have a whole lot of space, it may not be the best option for you. But if you do, go for it because homegrown cantaloupe is a delightful flavor. Again, with this one as well, sandy, well-drained soil, important, as well as powdery mildew. So this is a disease, kind of looks like someone spilled maybe like flour or something on the leaves of the plants. Powdery mildew can be an issue with a lot of our cucurbits. And that can increase with if you plant them too close together. And so if you were to squeeze so many cantaloupes all together, then it would be, you would have more disease. So you want to keep that canopy nice and open, lots of airflow can be helpful. So question in the chat, how can I enhance flavor development on cantaloupe? Sometimes with that, a lot of it is variety selection. And so some are better than others. Two, this is true for a lot of the fruits, but if you're over watering, providing too much water, sometimes that can decrease the sugars in your plants. Thing to keep in mind too with cantaloupe is that they are a climacteric fruit, and so that's to mean they can continue to ripen after they have been harvested. So tomatoes are also climacteric, bananas, avocados. Those are all climacteric fruits. And so you can pick a cantaloupe and let it sit and continue to ripen outside of the elements. And so that might help too if you let it sit for a little while and continue to ripen. Watermelon. So this is another one. So I think we mentioned okra, eggplants, and sweet potatoes. Watermelon is another one that will thrive in high temperatures. And so it's well suited for Oklahoma growing. Of course, the question with watermelon always how to tell when it's ripe. If you have any family secrets you feel comfortable sharing, you can throw those in the chat, but I'll share what I know, what I use. When I worked at a farmer's market for a little while, and I got to where I could hit the watermelon and tell how they were ripe, but I can't explain it. So a bit more of a quantitative way to tell if it's ripe is flipping over that watermelon and looking at the base of it where it was sitting on the soil. If that has begun to turn brown and have some cracking and really look worn, it's an indicator that it has is ready to ripen. Another way you can tell, so I was mentioning those tendrils, those curlicues. So at the joint on the plant where a watermelon sits on the vine, there will also be a tendril. And if that tendril has dried back all the way to the vine where that watermelon is attached, that can also indicate that it is ripe. So those are two ways to tell instead of sitting around and playing watermelon bongos and driving yourself crazy. And then to wrap up, summer squash and zucchini, we are harvesting immature fruits, and so we don't want to let the seeds develop. Biggest challenge with these two are going to be pests. So if you've ever tried to go summer squash, this squash bugs and the squash vine borers are just absolutely rotten. And so a couple different ways to stay on top of squash bugs. You can put like a board in your garden. They like to overnight, they kind of like to get underneath things. And so if you have a board out there, first thing in the morning, you can go out, flip it, and squash all the squash bugs that have been that have taken shelter under that board. The other thing too that you can do, I have some slides up here when we get to season-long success, but what's called a succession planting. And so that's where you continually plant at a certain interval new plants. And those younger squash can sometimes be more resilient to those pest pressures. So if you have one patch of squash succumbing to all the pests, a new one is coming on as that one is declining. And so that can be an option as well. So any questions on the warm season veggies before we move on to tips for a successful harvest? Okay, I don't see any. We're going to keep going. All right. So as you're growing veggies, there are a couple things that we can do to make sure that we have success and less headache while we're growing our plants, because hopefully at this point in the series, you know that putting plants in the ground is just the first step, and that we have to do many things after that to take care of our plants in order to have successful harvests. So with mulches, a lot of times in commercial production, you may see plastic mulches, but that's going to be very impractical in a homeowner setting. It's difficult to install without a tractor implementation. And so what the best option for homeowners is to use what we call an organic mulch. And so that's anything that's been alive at one point that will continue to break down and that we add back over time. And so we talked a lot about this in the soil portion of the series, about how using organic mulches, they can break down and add more organic matter to the soil, which helps with soil health. And so that's also very important. But a lot of times we're adding mulches, that's important, but we're adding mulches because it helps control weeds. And so using that can be helpful, but also regulating that soil moisture and that soil temperature to help with plant resiliency. So we're not seeing these huge swings of moisture and temperature in the soil, and that helps the plant tremendously. So I just mentioned it doesn't necessarily mean certified organic. So if you're not worried about growing in an organic setting, using organic mulches is still very important. And so just have some organic mulches listed here. I'm a big proponent of just using what you have on hand. So if you have a bunch of leaves around your property, that can make a great mulch, or pine. If you have a big pine tree, raking that up. There are, if you're in the city of Norman, you can get wood chips. You can get compost as well. So lots of different options. Depends on what your budget is and what it is that you want to look for. So Annette asked, what about pine needles? Pine needles are great. I love pine needles as mulch. They will very minutely and very slowly over time lower the pH within the soil, but typically with veggies, we need an acidic soil anyways, and so it's not really something to worry too much about. So absolutely, you can use pine needles. So I touched on crop rotation at the beginning when we were talking about crop families. And the concept here is we want to rotate where we put our plant families. And so many veggie families, they have, as they're closely related, they have similar diseases, they have similar pests, they have similar nutrient requirements. And so if you plant the same thing in the same spot year after year after year, the pests are going to figure it out and the soil is going to slowly become depleted. And so you want to rotate where you put your plant families. And that's why it's important to know what family a vegetable is in, so that you can use crop rotation in an efficient way. And so as you plan out your garden, just keep that in mind where you had certain things last year and move them around so that the pest pressure doesn't build up and the soil stays relatively balanced. Also touched on this a little bit as well, succession planting. And so essentially this is staggering your planting so that you can stagger your harvests. And so planting at a certain interval to space out those harvests. And this is great, especially for things like radishes or beets or those kind of one and done type crops. Because if you plant 250 radish seeds all at once, you may be harvesting 250 radishes all at once. And I've already talked about how I don't really like to eat radishes, and so 250 is way too many. But if you do like to eat radishes, that may still be too many. And so would recommend spacing that out so you can space your harvests out and enjoy them progressively. But you can do this with any crop, not just necessarily the one and done. So I mentioned with squash, it can be a helpful way to mitigate insects by having new, fresh, more resilient young plants in the garden as those older ones begin to fizzle out. Irrigation is very important. We need to water our plants. It is best to avoid overhead watering when watering the garden. What happens when we do that is it splashes the soil back on the leaves, and that can spread disease and bacteria, and we don't necessarily want that. So being able to water as close to the soil and the base of the plant is great. So the closer that we can get to the base of the plant is important. So some alternatives, we can do a drip irrigation, and there are a lot of different options with the drip irrigation, but we can also plant, if we plant in mounds and flood around the mounds and the furrows, that can be an option as well. So when it comes to drip irrigation, probably the easiest thing to do is use a soaker hose. Challenge with soaker hoses is that they're not very efficient, so they're not pressure regulated. So at the beginning of that soaker hose, you're going to have a lot of output of water, but as you get towards the end, it's going to be less water. So there's not consistency among that soaker hose. So a couple things, I mean, you can kind of sort of engineer where you put your soaker hose to even the balance, but it's a thing to consider. You can also get a little bit more efficient with drip lines. And so that's the picture there in the bottom right. And that's essentially like a drip tape that has emitters at certain intervals. And so each individual plant is getting a driplet of water as it's irrigating directly to the base of the plant. That's super great if you're growing in big long rows like the picture shows. But if you're growing in a raised bed, it can be a little bit challenging. So they also sell drip tubing, and drip tubing essentially is a tubing that you can puncture and add the emitters in and run and actually retrofit it to your entire into your entire space. So that is something that you can do as well. So it's just kind of up to your expense level or what you're willing to uh, engineer essentially. And so two couple things if you are doing a drip irrigation system, especially with the drip tape or the drip tubing, you want to have a pressure regulator so that typically lowers the pressure that's coming out of our valve because typically that's too high. So if you ever put in a tubing and you hear it whistling, that's an indicator that your pressure is too high. So you want a pressure regulator, and then you're also going to want to use a filter, and that keeps sediment from blocking the emitters. And then mentioned flooding too. So this is kind of a very sort of DIY way. This is kind of a bird's eye image of a pumpkin patch that I had started a few years ago. But essentially mounding up that soil and then just flooding in between so that that water will soak in and keep it nice and moist. I'll say it's not a very efficient use of water. You're using a lot of water in this setting. But if you're doing fall gardening where it's very, very hot and we need the temperature to be lower from the water, or if you're starting seeds and you need that consistent moisture, this can be a good option. And then mentioning too, so talked a lot about fertilizing and ways to amend our soils in the soil lecture. But keep in mind, sometimes our plants, our vegetables especially, will need a little bit of additional of a boost throughout the season. And so you can side dress. So that's just adding additional fertilizer, putting it about 4 to 6 inches away from the base of the plant and sort of scratching it in and then watering it. So it's right there available for the plant roots. There's also several types of water soluble fertilizers out there, so you can irrigate with that. So that can be something to think about. If you're wanting specific fertilizer recommendations throughout the season for specific vegetables, I would check out our fact sheets. It's probably the longest I've gone through a workshop before I mentioned fact sheets before. But check out our fact sheets. Our individual crop-based fact sheets have information on when to fertilize throughout the season for specific vegetables. And then lastly, with insects, we're going to do, I think it's 2 weeks from tonight, we are doing the insect control strategies webinar, but a couple things to mention in the context of vegetable gardening. Scouting and early detection is very important with insect control. So it's much easier to control a small population than it is a large population. And so looking and actually checking your plants on a regular basis is very important, especially if you know that a crop that you're growing is particularly susceptible to a particular pest. So for example, all the brassicas with the cabbage worm or squashes with the squash bug, looking for those is very important. It can also be a good idea to look around the area that you are growing. And if you have weeds in that area that are in the same family as a vegetable that you may be growing, that can potentially be a nice little safe haven for those insects. So just be aware and maybe try to control some of those diseases. This can be especially an issue in the nightshades. And then also, if you are going to use any insecticides, pay very, very closely to any pollinator warnings. because a lot of our vegetables are insect pollinated. And so if we're spraying something that kills all the insects, it will kill the pollinators as well. And we still don't end up with the vegetables that we are trying to harvest and enjoy. So pay very close attention to the label and what those pollinator warnings say if you are using insecticides. So to wrap up, resources, of course, got to mention the fact sheet website. So if you want additional information on certain crops or maybe fall gardening or anything like that, you can go here and look for that additional information. And that wraps us up for this evening. And I will take any questions that you have. Is there fact sheets up for weeds that hide insects? Great question. I don't think we have one. I know we have one on like weed identification, but I believe it's fairly lawn centric, rather than harboring an insects that may potentially harm vegetables. If you have a weed and you're not quite sure what it is, that is something you can email me or our Master Gardener Help Desk. And that can be, we can help you get that identified. So Donna asked about ways to provide shade for those on extra hot days. So I guess we haven't talked about season extension, but you may see sometimes these structures in gardens that are kind of like hoops. And a lot of, if you can walk through it, we call that a high tunnel. And if you can't walk through it, we call it a low tunnel. But a lot of times over raised beds, you may see some arches that we would call a low tunnel. And we can stick like plastics or frost cloth or anything over that to be able to grow in the winter. But I don't think we talk often enough about how we can use a shade cloth to be able to help with some of the intense heat that we may have. So that's something you could absolutely do, especially on those veggies that, like the tomato, that are warm season but not terribly heat tolerant. So just to add a little bit of relief. But yeah, using a type of shade cloth, even putting up sheets, that can just add just a little bit of relief to your plants. Any other questions? Awesome. Thank you, Andrea. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions, so we can go ahead and wrap up for this evening. I will send out the recording and the post assessment tomorrow. If you could please take the time to fill that out, and hope to see you next week. We are going to focus on the ornamental side, the pretty side of things. So join us for Flower Power next Thursday. Hope to see you then.